With this video, I want to go into more detail on the roll chart, which I introduced in the other video, and its importance, and maybe a few differences between how Murray and Richard Wilson explained it to me. So, let's start off with what Murray did. At the end of this video, there are also 2 printouts and also a link to where you can get a high quality PDF if you want to print one out for yourself. But at the end of the video, you can see the examples. There are 2 versions of the roll chart. The first one is the way Murray and Richard taught it to students. They just wrote it out with text. There was no notation. They just explained to you what they wanted and went from there. The second version is the one I've written out for the book about what Murray and Richard taught me. And so I had to use notation to show you because it's a book, not a video. Anyway, we're going to go on. Now, if you look at the first version, the text version, you'll notice that there are 2 columns and there's an accent or 2 accents above the 2 different columns. And that's just indicating that the rolls in the left column end with 1 accent and the rolls in the second column end with 2 accents. And that was a distinction Murray and Richard both drew in the rolls. Now, if you also look at the rolls, underneath the name of the roll, you'll see in some of the rolls, underneath, you'll see left hand, right hand, both. And then under some of the other rolls, you'll just see the word both. Okay, both just means alternate. The roll alternates. Left hand means you start with one hand and end with the other over and over. So you can start right-handed or you can start left-handed. Now, Murray and Richard wanted you to memorize the name of the roll and the mechanics, how many times you move your wrist to play it. And that's what over to the right of each roll, you'll see 3 counts or 4 counts. It's telling you how many times you move your wrist to play that roll. And that was the thing that's consistent between both Murray and Richard on how they explained what they wanted you to do. Now, since I already knew the rolls when I got to Murray and kind of already had a roll going, although my grip was, not what Murray showed me 5 minutes before he went into the rolls. So I was struggling with trying to figure out how do you put the fulcrum in the middle finger and not up here. And, I was struggling and I had never understood, this idea of up and down motions was totally new to me. I had just turned my wrist or rebounded and hit harder or used my arms and banged. I didn't have the sophistication of what Murray was showing me. So I was struggling with the new information and learning the roll chart. So Murray turned on the roll at a medium tempo. This is 96. And he started with 8th notes in his hands and talked again about make sure you go up to come down, which I also probably wasn't down. I was probably up here throwing the stick into the drum like everybody does. But up and down is the order of the day because you want to learn where the floor is. Where is that resting point? Stick just sits in your hand. If it's at rest, you're at rest. Those are important concepts that are different in Murray's and Richard's teaching from what everybody else does. So, I was struggling with all this, but Murray went forward and said, okay, so you're moving your wrists. If you bend your wrist a little bit, that fulcrum opens and you get a roll. Now, once I was rolling along with Murray and we were both playing these 16th notes together, he said, okay, I want you to start with a 7-stroke roll, and it's going to go one way, and since you're on the metronome with the right, that means the roll is going to end in the left. And I want you to count your wrist motions, and he said it out loud, and he demonstrated. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Well, that was a pretty easy concept, I got the idea. But I didn't make a very good but I've learned. That's where you start with this. Then he stopped and he said, okay, start with the other hand and go the other way so that this hand learns to do it. okay, well, I started rolling with my left. That was a little bit of a new idea. I didn't do a lot of left-handed rolling back then. Now it's not an issue, but 1, 2, 3, 4. So you're going the other way. And I played 7-stroke rolls in a little drum corps I played with, maybe for 6 months. So I'd learned a bunch of marches and how to play 5s and 7s and such. Then he said, okay, the word both means to alternate the roll. And I was kind of going, wait a second. You know, I was kind of up here in the air and hitting the drum, and because I was throwing it down, it didn't want to come up. And so I'm up here, and it's like, well, wait a second, I'm up here in the air. How do you start the roll down there? Because I could hear him. Play the roll both directions. And I was up here and I kind of like that. It was kind of like my roll was loud and soft, and I had no control of the dynamics from up here. That's one of the advantages of a floor. The higher you raise, the louder it gets. It's easy to control dynamics. It's as easy as walking and running. You just move faster, and the rest of it takes care of itself when you have a floor. It's like the earth is your floor. It takes care of itself. That's what you'll learn once you move up to come down. You start to go, oh, it's just like walking and running. No, I don't want to be a marching drummer. Why do marching drummers say, oh, you play loud strokes, and they call them full strokes, right? You can find it in the book. They want you to throw that stick down and pull it back up. And you use the energy of the drum head because you're throwing it down. The stick, you know, the head wants to throw it back. So you follow it back, and they say that's how you play loud notes. It works. You can play loud notes, but what is the purpose of this? I want you to stop and think about this for just a second. If you look at all the drum books, the books that advocate this method of full strokes, half strokes, tap strokes, the guy that wrote the book is a marching drummer, and you'll find a picture of him with the funny hat and the feather sticking out, and he has a marching drum around him, and he's demonstrating this way of playing. Is there a technical advantage to this? In other words, does this give you an advantage for speed or power over this? Absolutely not. Sorry. What is this for? Why did they say to do this? If you stop and just think about the history of drumming, and they're marching drummers, well, what do marching drummers do? When they march, you line them all up, right, in a row. And when 8 or 10 or 5 guys, however many you got in your row, are doing this simultaneously, you get 10 guys going, woo, 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 it looks cool. That's what it's for. It's entertainment. It doesn't give you any technical advantage for speed or power. None at all. And I will demonstrate in this video, and maybe in the next one that's coming up, why there's no technical advantage to this. It's just an old idea, and people are stuck on old ideas, and you know, they're married to them. They don't want to change. They've never heard Murray play. They never heard Richard play. But they have heard their students. And if you investigate, you will find out how many famous drummers that are out there that you probably listen to and think are great and you like how they play, studied with Murray or Richard, or maybe even both of them. So there's a reason people study with Murray and Richard. Famous drummers study with them. Guys that you and I are impressed with, and we go out and pay good money to see them play in concert and stuff. Okay, but they take lessons from Murray and Richard. They found value in this. So think about what I'm going to show you. You don't have to do this. Like I said, generations of drummers have been marching drummers, and this works. I'm just trying to show you an alternative that gives you advantages you don't get playing this old marching way. So, the roll chart. The whole purpose of the roll chart, Murray would have you play the rolls that alternate, like the 9 and the 5. Something you want to memorize in the chart, this will help you memorize them. They all have an odd name. In other words, 5, 7, 9, 11, 13. Those are all odd numbers. But if you look over to the right part of it, you'll see the column the counts, excuse me, some of them are even, some of them are odd. Okay, so realize that the even number rolls are the ones that the marching drum books say don't alternate, and that's why they all have left, right, both underneath of them. Because you can do them the marching way, left or right, and you can do them Murray's way once you understand how to alternate them. They can go both. That's what the word both meant. They would both write down the word both, not alternate. I don't know why. Anyway, if you look, some of the rolls just have the word both underneath them. Those are the ones that always alternate. So, memorize them, get the name of it in your mind and how many motions. Again, Murray sat there with the metronome going slow, started with those eighth notes, talked about wrist turns and up and down and my grip, and then he started rolling. Then went into the 7, like I showed you, and then he reversed it. Then he demonstrated to me how to reverse it every time. And then he went on to the other rolls. He stopped and then he went to the next roll. Then he said, okay, then they alternate. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1. So when you alternate, you have to pay attention to both hands throwing. When you don't alternate, you can work on one hand at a time. So approach it that way. If you're having trouble with the left, do the rolls and just go to the left hand and work on your left till you feel it improving and matching your right. That's the way to practice those things. Now, there is a difference in what Murray and Richard did. Murray was a drum set player. Excuse me, Richard was a drum set player. Murray was an orchestral Broadway drummer before he gave up drumming and became a famous sound engineer here in Hollywood doing movies. But since Richard was a drum set player, he insisted right at the first lesson. I was playing the roll chart with him and he said, what's wrong with your body? And I kind of, oh, what do you mean? He says, well, half your body's not working. Where's your feet? Huh? He said, use your feet, keep time. I don't know, Murray didn't do that. At Murray's lessons, he kind of had these high stools, he kind of half sat, half leaned against and played. At Richard's, he had 2 pads, 2 drum thrones, and you sat down, and he wanted those feet keeping time. Both feet, not just the right. That was even one of the mistakes I made. I had the habit of standing up in orchestra and sometimes tapping my feet at my right foot if I had to keep time in a hard passage. And he kind of laughed, what's wrong with your left foot? Make it work. You gotta remember, we didn't have double bass drum pedals back then. Nowadays it's easy for you guys. You got 2 pedals, right away you're moving your feet and doing, patterns with your feet. But back in those days we had really crappy bass drum pedals that didn't move like they do today. And to be honest with you, we had to stomp the bass drum pedal to make it loud enough to be heard against all the amplification because they didn't mic us back then. So, anyway, get your feet going with the metronome. That way, your left hand can practice the roll chart as the dominant one or the right. And it helps your coordination, your feet and hands settle down with each other. And Richard would insist that, okay, you don't stop between the rolls. This is an exercise. You want to work out your hands and feet. So, what he insisted you do is, in the beginning, you would just go down. You would go from the short rolls up to the long rolls. But after you practice that way for a few weeks, you start kind of mentally getting bored doing the same thing. So you can go from the short rolls up to the long rolls. You can go from the longest rolls down to the shortest rolls. Or you can jump from one to the other, or from left hand to right hand once you understand how to reverse things. The thing is to master those rolls, be able to go any length roll at any moment your mind desires. And Richard would have you roll and not stop. And he pointed this out to me. He says, look, if you just count how many rolls there are, if you play each roll, left-handed, right-handed, both, or both, each one for just a minute, and you roll in between for half a minute, you will see that that adds up to a half hour. So you're rolling nonstop for a half hour if you do that. Since I'm not there observing you play, I want to give you some general things that I learned from Richard Wilson about teaching the roll and the roll chart. And it primarily has to do with different tempos. Richard felt that if you were a beginner, when you arrived with him, he would teach you to turn the wrists and wanted you to build that wrist turn speed up to 120 beats per minute. So let me get this here to 120. Here we go. So he felt that you needed to be able to lift up and down and return the stick to the floor, not be struggling with your old maybe habits of being marching techniques. He felt you needed that control because at 120, it barely takes any bend of the wrist to open those fingers enough to induce the roll. Now remember, the whole idea here in this world of Murray and Richard was that you let that fulcrum point in the middle finger open a little bit by bending down. I'm exaggerating, you'll see, but the tiniest little motion affects the pressure in your finger where the stick is sitting. And if you move down, it takes pressure off the stick and it starts to move over the fulcrum. I'm not making it move. I'm not using finger control and wiggling it around. I'm using gravity and its effect on the weight of the stick when you have a fulcrum point. That's what a fulcrum is. That's how it functions. That is not a rebound. This is misinterpretation of the word. So, the metronome at 120. The problem though, you might not be able to make up and downs that fast. So, the process then is to slow down the doubles once you learn how to do them. Now I'm dealing with a beginner here, okay? If you already understand how to roll and you're using the old fulcrum, then you're going to have to learn how to use this new concept of the fulcrum. But since you already understand what a bounce is, you've felt it in your hands before, it's a matter of moving it to the middle finger. So you, if you're an experienced drummer, have to find a tempo where you can feel the stick resting in your middle finger. With me, it was slower. Like I mentioned earlier in the video, I started with Murray around 96, 92. Now, here's the problem all beginners have. When you're trying to learn this, people tend to let go with these guide fingers to force the stick to sit in their middle finger because they want it to sit there, and they find themselves fighting here because they've been holding it there for a lot of years playing drums. So if you've already been playing, you're going to have to deal with that. How do you get the stick to sit there and keep these guide fingers holding on, guiding the stick? Because the slower you slow down, the more that induces the desire of these fingers to let go. And that is the initial process with rolling. Is you're not going to speed up, you're going to go the other direction and slow down. Okay? Now, the problem with tempo, and this is something specific that Richard taught me, is that most students in the beginning have difficulty getting below 100 and keeping the fulcrum and not releasing. So 100 beats per minute is sort of a trouble area as you go down. The slowest you can do this is 80. Let me get this funky metronome to 80. Come on, there you go. 80. Okay. We're going to go on now at 80. This is as slow as you play the roll with just a wrist turn and a bend. Below this, the stick will not bounce evenly unless you give it a little more mass with a throw. Then it can go very slow. But once it's that slow, just hold the stick and turn your wrist most of the time. But the reason for slowing down is it makes you develop awareness of the fulcrum. The slower you go, if you look now, you'll see my wrists are bending considerably more than they were up at 120. So that whole process of slowing down from 120 down to 80 teaches you how to let those fingers open and close, not lose your guide fingers, maintain the fulcrum. It's all those relationships that are occurring as you're moving. Slowing down brings it all into focus and what it feels like. Once you get down to 80, well, it's slow enough that you can work on your up and down motion too and not feel stressful. Yeah, I gotta go up and down faster. So the process is slow down, get the motions working the right way, then turn it around and start bringing it back up. And you're doing that all that time, you're doing the roll chart. So as you bring it up, you eventually can play all your rolls pretty quick. Now the other danger area is 182 beats per minute. Richard felt that at 182 and above, most students have a difficulty. Here's 182. At 182 is a problem where people have trouble letting go enough to keep the roll open. As you bring the tempo up and play louder, you have to hold on with a little more pressure. But more pressure makes the stick go faster, and that makes it want to start to close into a closed roll rather than an open roll. So there's a pressure thing that happens as you go faster that you will discover when you get there. So wait till you get there, you'll feel it. Okay, one little more detail I wanted to mention about the roll chart is in this process of starting at 120 and slowing down to 80, what is happening is you are teaching your hand to bend further and letting the finger, 3 fingers and where the fulcrum is sitting, change its pressure as you move down and back and forth. That pressure in your middle finger where the fulcrum is changes all by itself in relation to the angle of your wrist. So as you're slowing down, that angle is going to increase to make those back fingers open more, which has to occur to slow down. You have to open more and have less pressure in the fulcrum. But as I mentioned previously, the students tend to let go here as you're learning that process. So that's the purpose of slowing down, is to get the guide fingers stable so they can hold on at a constant, comfortable pressure. And these 3 fingers can change pressure. So it takes a while to get these 3 independent of these 2, and that's the purpose of slowing down. You learn how to hold this and let the other fingers move as you bend more. And then you get down slow, and that puts a certain suppleness and relaxation in your hand. It starts to respond to your wrist moving those fingers, and then as you bring up the speed, it becomes more just an issue of turning the wrist faster. Because as you go faster, that fulcrum is going to barely open. When you start passing 182, heading towards closed rolls, you just barely, it feels more like a pressure change than the hand opening and closing. It just feels like there's a little pressure change against the stick. And you can't find that and determine how to control that without learning to slow down and get the full range of motion happening in your hand. That's how you get control of this. So be patient. I'm sorry, I know it's boring to practice slow, but practicing slow is ultimately what gives you the speed in the end. It's not trying to go real fast that gives you the speed. Once you understand the motion, you can command your body to do it as fast as you are as a person. And that goes more back to your nervous system itself, how fast the electric system is firing through your muscles and arriving where you want it to go, your brain. All that is an interconnection that is developed in childhood. That's why drummers that start at 4 or 5 are faster than everybody else. They get these motions to some degree in their body going at an early age, so that by the time they're 15 or 20, they've already been doing this for 10 years, where the rest of us that start as teenagers, well, you're not doing this till you're in your 20s. So there's an advantage in terms of speed if you start younger. And if you're lucky when you start young, you might even end up with lots of musical experience. If your parents are smart enough to take you around to jam sessions and getting you playing with adults and stuff as you're a child, you're going to learn a lot more about music and being a musician than if you're just sitting at home taking lessons from somebody and playing the records. So experience is an important part of all this, not just technique. But technique gives you control and command and helps you have a good sound when you play. And that's part of what people relate to. How do you sound to them when you're playing with them?